Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlor of the George and Dibbin, the undertaker and the landlord, and Fettes in the seat. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we 4 would each be planted in his own particular armchair. Fettes was an old drunken Scotchman, a man of education, obviously, and a man of some property, since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham yearsly, while still young, and by a mere continuance of living he had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlor at the George, his absence from church, his own crabbedness, disreputable vices, were all things of course in Devon. His vague radical opinions and some fleeting infidelities, which he would now and again set forth and emphasize with tottering steps upon the table. He drank rang, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George sat with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known, upon a pinch, to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. But beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character or antecedents. One dark winter night, it had struck 9 some time before the landlord joined us. There was a sick man in the Jowett, a great neighbouring proprietor suddenly struck down with apoplexy on his way to Parliament, and the great man's still greater London doctor had been telegraphed to his bedside. It was the first time that such a thing had happened in Gibbon, for the railway was but newly opened. We were all proportionally moved by the occurrence. "He's come," said the landlord, after he filled and lighted his pipe. "He?" said I. "Who? Not the doctor?" "Himself," replied our host. "What's his name?" "Dr. Macfarlane," said the landlord. Hattie's was far through his 3rd tumbler, stupidly followed now, nodding over and staring mazedly round him, but at the last word he seemed to awaken, and repeated the name Macfarlane twice, quietly enough the first time, but with sudden emotion in the second. "Yes," said the landlord, "that's his name. Got a Wolf Macfarlane." Sedes became instantly sober. His eyes awoke, his voice became clear, loud, and steady, his language forcible and earnest. We were all startled by the transformation, as if a man had risen from the dead. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I am afraid I have not been paying much attention to your talk. Who is this Wolf Macfarlane?" And then, when he had heard the landlord out, "It cannot be, he added. "And yet I would like well to see him face to face." "Do you know him, doctor?" said the undertaker with a gasp. "Good thought a bit," was the reply. "And yet the name's a strange one. It were too much to fancy too. Tell me, landlord, is he old?" "Well," said the host, "he's not a young man to be sure, and his hair is white, but looks younger than you. He's older, though, years older, but," with a supple on the table, "it's Rome you see in my face. Rome and sin. This man perhaps may have an easy conscience and good digestion. Conscience, let me speak. You would think I was some good old decent Christian, would you not? But you're not only. I'm never a catered. Whome'er may have catered if it's from my shoe. But the brains," with a rattling fillip at his bald head, "the brains were queer and active, and so I made no deductions." "If you know this doctor," I ventured to remark, after a somewhat awful pause, "I should gather that you do not share the landlord's good opinion." Fettes paid no regard to me. "Yes," he said with sudden decision, "I must see him face to face." There was another pause, and then a door was closed rather sharply on the first floor, and a step was heard upon the stair. "That's the doctor," cried the landlord. "Look sharp, and you can catch him." It was but 2 steps from the small parlor to the door of the old George. The wide oak staircase landed almost in the street. There was room for a turkey rug and nothing more between the threshold and the last round of the descent. But this of the space was every evening brilliantly lit up, not only by the light upon the stair and the great signal lamp below the sign, but by the warm radiance of the bar-room window. The George thus brightly advertised itself to passers-by in the cold street, that it is walked steadily to the spot, and we, who were hanging behind, beheld the 2 men meet, as one of them phrased it, face to face. Dr. Macfarlane was alert and vigorous. His white hair set off his pale and placid, though energetic countenance. He was richly dressed in the finest of broadcloth, and the whitest of linen, with a great gold watch chain with studs and spectacles of the same precious material. He wore a broad-folded tie, white and speckled with lilac, and he carried on his arm a comfortable driving coat of fur. There was no doubt but he became his years, breathing as he did of wealth and consideration. And it was a surprising contrast to see our parlor thought, bald, dirty, pimpled, and robed in his old camlet cloak, confront him at the bottom of the stairs. "McFarlane Wynne," he said somewhat loudly, more like a herald than a friend. The great doctor pulled up short at the fourth step, as though the familiarity of the address surprised and somewhat shocked his dignity. "Tony McFarlane," repeated Fettes. The London man almost staggered. He stared for the swiftest of seconds at the man before him, glanced behind him with a sort of scare, and then in a startled whisper, "Fettes," he said, "you?" "I," said the other, "me. Did think I was dead, too? We're not so easily shut out of our acquaintance." "Hush, hush," claimed Hush, hush. This meeting is so unexpected. I can see that you're unmanned. I hardly know you. I confess at first, but I am overjoyed to have this opportunity. For the present it must be how do you do and goodbye in one, for my fly is waiting, and I must not fail the train. But you shall let me see, yes, you shall give me your address, and you can count on early news of me. We must do something for you, Fettes. I fear you are out to tell those, but we must see to that for Auld Lang Syne. There's one who sang at suppers." "Money," cried Fettes. "Money, cry you? The money I have from you will be, and I cast it noe." Dr. McFarlane talked himself into some measure of superiority and confidence, but the uncommon energy of his refusal cast him back into his first confusion. A horrible, ugly look came and went across his most venerable countenance. "My dear fellow," he said, "be it as you please. My last thought is to offend you. I will intrude no more. I will leave you my address, however. I do no more, sir." "I do not wish to know the lost is here, it is here," interrupted the other. "I heard your name. I feared it might be you. I wish to know if after all there were a God. I know now that there is none. Begone." He stood in the middle of the rug between the stair and doorway, and the great London physician, in order to escape, would be forced to set to one side. It was plain that he hesitated before he thought of this humiliation. White as he was, there was a dangerous glitter in his spectacles, and while he still paused uncertain, he became aware that the driver of his fly was peering in from the street at this unusual scene, and caught a glimpse at the same time of our little body from the parlor huddled by the corner of the bar. The presence of so many witnesses decried him at once to flee. He crashed together, brushing on the wainscot, and made a dart like a serpent, striking for the door. But his tribulation was not yet entirely at an end, for even as he was passing, Fettes clutched him by the arm, and these words came in a whisper and yet painfully distinct: "Have you seen it again?" The great, rich London doctor cried out with a sharp, throbbing cry. He dashed his questioner across the open space, and, with his hands over his head, fled out the door like a detected thief. Before it occurred to one of us to make a movement, the fly was already rattling toward the station. The scene was over like a dream, but the dream was as proofs and traces of its passage. The next day the servant found the fine gold spectacles broken on the threshold, and that very night we were standing breathless by the bar-room window, and Fettes at our side, sober, pale, and resolute in look. "Don't look at us, Mr. Fettes," said the landlord, coming first into possession of his customary senses. "What members is a praying fridge of a tray?" Fettes turned toward us. He looked us each in succession in the face. Said he, "Hold your tongue," said he, "but my McFarlane is not safe to cross. Therefore guns for already have repented it too late." And then, without so much as finishing his third glass, far less waiting for the other two, he bade us good-bye and went forth under the lamp of the hotel into the black night. We three turned to our places in the parlor, with the big red fire and 4 clear candles, and as we recapitulated what had passed, the first chill of our surprise soon changed into glow of curiosity. We sat late. It was the latest session I have known in the Old George. Each man before we parted had his theory that he was bound to prove, and none of us had any nearer business in this world than to track out the past of our condemned companion, and surprise the secret that he shared with the great London doctor. It was no great boast, but I believe I had a better hand at worming out the story than either of my fellows at the George, and perhaps there is now no other man alive who can narrate to you in the following unnaturality. In his young days Fettes studied medicine in the schools of Edinburgh. He had a talent of a kind, the talent that picks up swiftly what it hears and readily retails it for his own. He worked little at home, but he was civil, attentive, and intelligent in the presence of his masters. They soon picked him out as a lad who listened closely and remembered well. Nay, strange as it seemed to me when I first heard it, he was in those days well favored and pleased by his exterior. There was at that period a certain extramural teacher of anatomy, whom I shall designate by the letter K. His name was subsequently too well known. The man who bore it skulked through the streets of Edinburgh in disguise, while the mob that applauded at the execution of Burke had called loudly for the blood of his employer. Monsieur K. was then at the top of his vogue, and he enjoyed a popularity due partly to his own talent and address, partly to the incapacity of his rival, the university professor. The students at least were by his name, and Fettes believed himself, and was believed by others, to have made the foundations of success when he acquired the favor of this meteorically famous man. Monsieur K. was a bold villain as well as an accomplished teacher. He liked to fly illusion no less than a care for preparation. In both capacities Fettes enjoyed and deserved his notice, and by the second year of his attendance he held the half-regular position of second demonstrator or sub-assistant in his class. In this capacity charge of the theatre and lecture room devolved in particular upon his shoulders. He had to answer for the cleanliness of the premises and the conduct of the other students, and it was a part of his duty to supply, receive, and divide the various subjects. It was with a view to this last, at that time very delicate, affair, that he was lodged by Mr. K. in the same wind, and at last in the same building with the dissecting rooms. Here, after a night of turbulent pleasures, his hands still tottering, his sight still misty and confused, he would be called out of bed in the black hours before winter dawn by the unclean and desperate interlopers who supplied the table. He would open the door to these men, since infamous throughout the land. He would help them with their tragic burden, pay them their sordid price, and remain alone when they were gone with the unfriendly relics of humanity. From such a scene he would return to snatch another hour or two of slumber, to repair the abuse of the night, and refresh himself for the labors of the day. Few lads could have been more insensible to the impressions of the life thus passed among the ensigns of mortality. His mind was closed against all general considerations. He was incapable of interest to the fate and fortunes of another, the slaves of his own desires and low ambitions. Cold, light, and selfish in the last resort, he had that modicum of prudence, miscalculated morality, which keeps a man from inconvenient drunkenness or punishable theft. He coveted besides a measure of consideration from his masters and his fellow pupils, and he had no desire to fail conspicuously in the external parts of life. Thus he made it his pleasure to gain some distinction in his studies, and day after day rendered unimpeachable eye service to his employer Mr. K. For his day of work he indemnified himself by nights, by roaring blackguardly enjoyment, and when that balance had even struck, the organ that he called his conscience declared itself content. The supply of subjects was a continual trouble to him as well as to his master. In that large and busy class the raw materials of the anatomist kept perpetually running out, and the business thus rendered necessary was not only unpleasant in itself, but threatened dangerous consequences to all who were concerned. It was the policy of Mr. K. to ask no questions in his dealings with the trade. "They bring a body, and we pay the price," he used to say, dwelling on the alliteration quid pro quo. And again, and somewhat profanely, "Ask no questions," he would tell his students, "for conscience sake." There was no understanding the subjects were provided by the crime of murder. Had the idea been broached to him in words, he would have required and heard her. But the lightness of speech upon so grave a matter was in itself an offense against good manners, and a temptation to the men with whom he dealt. Fettes, for instance, had often remarked to himself upon the singular freshness of the bodies. He had been struck again and again by the hang-dog abominable looks of the ruffians who came to him before the dawn, and putting things together clearly in his private thoughts, he perhaps attributed a meaning too immoral and too categorical to the unguarded counsels of his master. He understood his duty, in short, to have three branches: to take what was brought, to pay the price, and to avert the eye from any evidence of crime. One November morning this policy of silence was put sharply to the test. He had been awake all night without a racking toothache, pacing his room like a caged beast or throwing himself in fury upon his bed, and had fallen at last into that profound uneasy slumber that so often follows on a night of pain. And he was awakened by the third or fourth angry repetition of the concerted signal. There was a thin, bright moonshine. It was bitter cold, windy and frosty. The town not yet awakened, but an indefinable stir already precluded the noise and business of the day. The ghouls had come out later than usual, and they seemed more than usually eager to be gone. Fetters, sick with sleep, lighted them upstairs. He heard their grumbling Irish voices through a dream, and as he stripped the sack from the sad merchandise, he leaned dozing with his shoulder propped against the wall. He had to shake himself to find the men their money. As he did so, his eyes lighted on the dead face. He started. He took 2 steps nearer with the candle raised. "God Almighty," he cried. "I've kind Dealberth." The men said nothing, but they shuffled near the door. "I mean, I tell you," he continued, "she was a limeyite, yesterday. It's impossible that she could be dead. It's impossible he should have got this body fairly." "Sure, sir, you're mistaken entirely," said one of the men. But the other looked Fitz hysterically in the eyes, and demanded the money on the spot. It was impossible to misconceive the threat or exaggerate the danger. The lad's heart failed him. He stammered some excuses, counted out the sum, and saw his hateful visitors depart. No sooner were they gone than he hastened to confirm his doubts. By a dozen unquestionable marks, he identified the girl he had jested with the day before. He saw with horror marks upon the body that might well betoken violence. A panic seized him, and he took refuge at his room. There he reflected in length over the discovery that he had made, considered soberly the bearing of Mr. K's instructions, and the danger to himself of interference in so fervent a business, had at last, in some perplexity, determined to wait for the advice of his immediate superior, the class assistant. This was the young Dr. Walsh Macfarlane, a high favorite among all the reckless students, clever, dissipated, and unscrupulous to the last degree. He had traveled and studied abroad. His manners were agreeable and a little forward. He was an authority on the stage. Skillful and the eye saw the links with skate or golf club. He dressed with nice audacity, and to put a finishing touch upon his glory, he kept a gig and a strong trotting horse. With Fettis he was on terms of intimacy indeed. Their relative positions called for some community of life, and when subjects were scarce the pair would drive far into the country in Macfarlane's gig, visit and desecrate some lonely graveyard, and return before dawn with the booty to adorn the dissecting room. On that particular morning Macfarlane arrived somewhat earlier than his wont. Fetters heard him and met him on the stairs, told him the story, and showed him the cause for his alarm. Macfarlane examined the marks on her body. "Yes," he said with a nod, "it looks fishy." "Well, what shall I do?" asked he. "Do?" repeated the other. "Do you want to do anything?" asked Subtitles. "That should say." "Someone else might recognize the object," said he, "since as well known as the Castle Rock." "We'll hope not," said Macfarlane, "and if anybody does, well, you didn't, don't you see, and there's an end. The fact is, this has been going on too long. Stir up the mob, you'll get caged in the most unholy trouble. You'll be in the shucking box yourself. So will I, if you come to that. I should like to know how any one of us would look, or what the devil we would have to save ourselves in any Christian witness box. For me, you know, there's one thing certain, that, practically speaking, all of our subjects have been murdered." "My fun!" cried Fetters. "Come, now," sneered the other, "as if you hadn't suspected it yourself. Suspecting is one thing, and proof another. Yes, I know, and I'm as sorry as you are this should have come here," tapping the bobby with his cane. "The next best thing for me is not to recognize it. And," he said coolly, "I don't. You may, if you please. I don't dictate, but I think a man of the world would do as I do. And I may add, I fancy that is what they would look at with our hands. The question is, why did he choose us for 2 assistants? And I answer because he didn't want old Y." This was the tone of all others to affect the mind of a lad like Fetters. He agreed to imitate Macfarlane. The body of the unfortunate girl was duly dissected, and no one remarked or appeared to recognize her. One afternoon when his day's work was over, Fetters dropped into a popular tavern, and found Macfarlane sitting with a stranger. This was a small man, very pale and dark, with coal-black eyes. The cut of the features gave a promise of intellect and refinement, but which was feebly realized in his manners, for he proved, upon nearer acquaintance, coarse, vulgar, and stupid. He exercised to have a very remarkable control over McFarlane, issued orders like the great Bradshaw, became inflamed at the least discussion or delay, and commended rudely on the civility in which he was obeyed. This most offended person took a fancy to Fettes on the spot, plied him with drinks, and offered him with unusual confidences in his past career. If a tenth part of what he confessed was true, it was a very loathsome road, and the lad's vanity was tickled by the attention of so experienced a man. "I'm a pretty bad fellow myself," the stranger remarked, "but McFarlane is the boy. Toddy McFarlane, I called him. Toddy Millie, your friend, other glass. Or it might be, Toddy, you jump up and shut the door." "Toddy hates me," he said again. "Oh, yes, Toddy, you do." "Don't you call me that confounded name," growled McFarlane. "Hear him? Did you ever see the lad's blade knife?" "He would like to do that all over my body," remarked the stranger. "We medicals have a better way than that," said Fettes. "When we dislike a dead friend of ours, we dissect him." My father looked up sharply, as though this jest was scarcely on his mind. The afternoon passed. Gray, for that was the stranger's name, invited Fettes to join them at dinner, ordered a feast so sumptuous that the tavern was thrown into commotion, and when all was then, commanded McFarlane to settle the bill. It was mended before they separated. The man Gray was incapably drunk. McFarlane, sobered by his fury, chewed the cud of the money he had been forced to squander, and the slight he had been obliged to swallow. Fettes, with various liquors singing in his head, returned home with devious footsteps and a mind entirely in abeyance. The next day McFarlane was absent from class, and Fettes smiled to himself as he imagined him still quiring the intolerable Gray from tavern to tavern. As soon as the hour of liberty had struck, he posted from place to place in quest of his last night's compaverns. He could find him, however, nowhere, so he returned early to his room, went early to bed, and slept the sleep of the just. At 4 in the morning he was awakened by a well-known signal. Descending to the door, he was filled with astonishment to find McFarlane with his gig, and in the gig one of those long and ghastly packages with which he was so well acquainted. "What?" he cried. "Have you been out alone? How did you manage?" "What he frighteth," had his team roughly been in return to business. When they had got the body upstairs and laid it on the table, McFarlane made at first as if he were going away. Then he paused and seemed to hesitate, and then, "You had better look at the face," said he in tones of some constraint. "You had better," he repeated, as Fetters only stared at him in wonder. "But where, and how and when did you come by it?" cried the other. "Look at the face," was the only answer. Fetters was staggered. Strange doubts assailed him. He looked from the young doctor to the body, and then back again. At last, with a start, he did as he was bidden. He had almost expected the sight that met his eyes, and yet the shock was cruel. To see fixed in the rigidity of death and naked in that coarse lay of sackcloth, the man whom he had left well clad and full of meat and sin upon the threshold of a tavern, awoke, even in the thoughtless Frettius, some of the terror of the conscience. It was crass Tibby which re-echoed in his soul that the tomb had known should have come to lie upon these icy tables. Yet these were only secondary thoughts. The first concern regarded Wolfe. Unprepared for a challenge so momentous, he knew not how to look his comrade in the face. He durst not meet his eye, and he had neither words nor voice at his command. It was McFarlane himself who made the first advance. He came up quietly behind and laid his hand gently but firmly on the other's shoulders. "Richardson," said he, "may have the head." Now Richardson was a student who had long been anxious for that portion of the human subject to dissect. There was no answer, and the murderer resumed. "Talk your business. You must pay me. Your accounts, you see, must tally." Letty found a voice, the ghost of his own. "Pay you?" he cried. "Pay you for that?" "Lay you for course you must." "By all means and on every possible account you must," returned the other. "I dare not give it for nothing. You dare not take it for nothing. It would compromise us both. This is another case like Jane Gilbert's. The more things are wrong, the more we must act if we're all right. Where does old Kate keep his money?" "There," answered Fettes hoarsely, pointing to a cupboard in the corner. "Give me the key, then," said the other calmly, holding out his hand. There was an instant's hesitation in the dotcom, but Fawn could not suppress a nervous twitch, the infinitesimal mark of an immense relief, as he felt the key between his fingers. He opened the cupboard, brought out pen and ink and a paper book that stood in one compartment, and separated from the funds in a drawer of some suitable to the occasion. "Now look here," he said. "There is the payment made. First proof of your good faith, first step to your security. You have, now, to clinch it by the second. Enter the payment in your book, and then you, for your part, may defy the devil." The next few seconds were for Fettes an agony of thought, but in balancing his tires it was the most immediate that triumphed. Any futile difficulty him seemed almost welcome if he could avoid a present quarrel with Macfarlane. He set down the candle which he had been carrying all this time, and with a steady hand entered the date, the nature, and the amount of the transaction. "And now," said Macfarlane, "it is only fair that you should pocket the lucre. I've had my share already. Father, when a man of the world falls into a bit of luck, he has a few shillings extra in his pocket. I'm ashamed to speak of it. But there is a rule to conduct in the case. No treating, no purchase of expensive class boats, no squaring of old debts. Borrow, don't lend." "No queering," began Fettes, still somewhat hoarsely. "I put my neck in the halter to oblige you." "To oblige me?" cried Wolfe. "Oh, calm. You did as near as I can see in the matter, and you downright had to do it in self-defense. Suppose I got into trouble, where would you be? The second little matter flows clearly from the first. Mr. Gray is the continuation of Miss Gilbray. You can't begin and then stop. If you begin, you must keep on beginning, and that's the truth. No rest for the wicked." A horrible sense of blackness in the treacherous face seized upon the soul of the unhappy student. "My God!" he cried. "But what have I done? Where do I begin? To be met across a system in the name of a reason, where is the harm in that? Service wanted the position. Service my abhorrent. Would he have been what I am now?" "My dear fellow," said my father, "what a boy you are. What harm has come, what harm can come to you if you hold your tongue? Well, man, do you know what this light is? There are two squads of us, the lions and the lamb. If you're a lamb, you'll come to lie upon these tables like Gray or Jane Dilbert. And you're a lion, you'll live and drive a horse like me. Like Kay, like Holywood with any wit or curs. You're staggered at the fur. But look at Kay, my dear fellow, you're clever, I like you, and dear likes you. You have born to lead the hunt, and I tell you on my honor and my experience of life, 3 days from now you'll laugh at all these scarecrows like a high school boy at a farce." And with that Macfarlane took his departure, and drove up the wind in his gig to get under cover before daylight. Fettes was left alone with his regrets. He saw the miserable peril at which he stood involved. He saw with inexpressible dismay that there was no limit to his weakness, and that, from concession to concession, he had fallen from the arbiter of Macfarlane's destiny to his paid and helpless accomplice. He would have given the world to have been a little braver at the time, but it did not occur to him that he might still be brave. The secret of Jane Gilbert and the cursed entry in the daybook closed his mouth. Hours passed. The class began to arrive. The members of the unhappy Gray were dealt out to one and to another, and received without remark. Richardson was made happy with the head, and before the hour of freedom rang, Fettes trembled with exultation to perceive how far they had already gone towards safety. For 2 days he continued to watch with increasing joy the dreadful process of disguise. On the 3rd day Macfarlane made his appearance. He had been ill, he said, but he had made up for lost time by the energy which he directed his students. To Richardson in particular he extended the most valuable assistance and advice, and that student, encouraged by the praise of the demonstrator, burned high with ambitious hopes, and saw the medal already in his grasp. Before the week was out, Macfarlane's prophecy had been fulfilled. Fitzgerald, living Ferrers, had forgotten his baseness. He had thrown himself upon his carriage, and so arranged the story in the mind that he could look back on these events with an unhealthy pride. These Curmpus he saw but little, then met of course in the business of the class. They received their orders together from Mr. K. At times they had a word or two in private, and Macfarlane was from first to last particularly kind and jovial. But he was plain that he avoided any reference to their common secret, and even when Phyllis whispered to him that he had cast his lot with the lions and forsworn the lambs, he only signed him smilingly to hold his peace. At length an occasion arose which threw the pair once more into a closer union. Mr. K. was again short of subjects, pupils were eager, and it was a part of this teacher's pretensions to be always well supplied. At the same time, there came news of a burial in the rustic graveyard of Glencorse. Time had little changed the place in question. It stood then as now upon a crossroad, out of crawl of human inhabitants, and buried fathom deep in the foliage of sycamore trees. The cries of the sheep upon the neighboring hills, the streamlets upon either hand, one loudly singing among pebbles, the other dripping furtively from pond to pond, the stir of the wind in mountainous overflowing chestnut, and once in 7 days the voice of the bell and the old tunes of the precentor, were the only sounds that disturbed the silence around the rural church. The Resurrection Man, to use the by-name of the period, was not to be deterred by any of the sanctities of customary piety. It was fought with strive to despise and deprecate the scrolls and trumpets of old tombs, the parts worn by the feet of worshippers and mourners, and the offerings and inscriptions of bereaved affection. In rustic neighborhoods where love is more commonly tenacious than where some bonds of blood and fellowship unite the entire society of a parish, the body-snatcher, far from being repelled by natural respect, was attracted by the ease and safety of the task. To bodies that had been laid in earth, in joyful expectation of a far different awakening, there came that hasty lamplit, terror-haunted resurrection of the spade and mattock. The coffin was forced, the cremels torn, and the melancholy relics, clad in sackcloth, after being rattled for hours in moonless byways, were at length exposed to uttermost indignities before closet gaping boys. Somewhat as 2 vultures may swoop upon a dying lamb, Fetters and McFarlane were to be let loose upon a grave in that green and quiet resting-place. The wife of a farmer, a woman who had lived for 60 years and been known for nothing but good butter and godly conversation, was to be rooted from her grave at midnight and carried, dead and naked, into that far-away city that she had always honored with her Sunday's best. The place beside her family was to be empty till the crack of doom, her innocent, almost venerable members to be exposed to that last curiosity of the anatomist. Late one afternoon the pair set forth, well wrapped in cloaks and furnished with a formidable bottle. It rained without remission, a cold, dense, and lashing rain. Now again there blew a puff of wind, but these sheets of falling water kept it down. Bottle and all, it was a sad and silent drive as far as Pennachoke, where they would spend the evening. They stopped once to hide their implements in a thick bush not far from the churchyard, and once again at the Fisher's Tryst, to have a toast before the kitchen fire and vary their nips of whiskey with a glass of ale. When they reached their journey's end, the gig was housed, the horse was fed and comforted, and the 2 young doctors in a private room sat down to the best dinner and the best wine the house could afford. The light, the fire, the beating rain upon the window, the cold, incongruous work that lay before them, added zest to their enjoyment of the meal. With every glass their cordiality increased. Soon McFarlane handed a little pile of gold to his companion. "A compliment," he said. "Between friends, these little dead accommodations ought to fly like a pipe-light." Fettes pocketed the money and applauded the sentiment to the echo. "You're a philosopher," he cried. "I was an arson till I knew you're a between you by the Lord Harry, but you'll make a lot of me." "Of course we will," applauded my father. "A man? I tell you it required a man to back me up the other morning. There was a big bawling 40-year-old coward who would have turned sick at the look of the dead thing, but not you. You kept your head. I watched you." "Well, and why not?" Fettes just vented himself. "There was no affair of mine. There was not the gain in the one said, but disturbance, and the other I could count in thy gratitude. I to see—" and he snapped his pocket till the gold pieces rang. McFarlane somehow felt a certain touch of alarm at these unpleasant words. He regretted that he had taught his third companion so successfully, but he had no time to interfere, while the other noisily continued his boastful strain. "The great thing is not to be afraid. Now, between you and me, I don't want to hang, that's practical. But for all I can't, McFarlane, I was born with content. Hell, grog, devil, right, wrong, soon prime, at all the old gallery of curiosities. Lou me frighten boys, but men of the world like you and me despise them. Movies by the memory of Gray. He was by this time growing somewhat late. The king, according to order, was brought round the door with both lamps brightly shining, and the young men had to pay the bill and take the road. They announced that they were bound for Pebbles, and drove in that direction till they were clear of the last houses of the town. Then, extinguishing their lamps, they turned upon their course and followed a by-road toward Glencorse. There was no sound but that of their own passage and the incessant strident pouring of the rain. It was pitch dark. Here and there a white gate or a white stone in the wall guided them for a short space across the night, but for the most part it was at a foot-pace, and almost groping, that they picked their way through the resin blackness of their Solomon ice-led destination. In the sucking woods that traversed the neighborhood of the burying ground, the last glimmer failed them, and it became necessary to kindle a match and re-illume one of the lanterns of the gig. Thus, under the dripping trees, and environed by huge and moving shadows, they reached the scene of their unhallowed labors. They were both experienced in such affairs and powerful with the spade, and they had scarce been 20 minutes at their task before they were awarded by a dull rattle of the coffin lid. At the same moment, Macfarlane, having hurt his hand upon a stone, flung it carelessly above his head. The grave in which they now stood almost to the shoulders was close to the edge of the plateau of the graveyard, and the gig lamp had been propped, the better to illuminate their labors, against a tree, and on the immediate verge of the steep bank descending to the stream. Chance had taken a shore lamp with a stone. Then came a clang of broken glass. Night fell upon them. Sounds alternately dull and ringing announced the bounding of the lantern down the bank, and its occasional collision with the trees. A stone or two which had dislodged in its descent rattled behind it into the profundities of the glen. And then silence, like night, resumed its sway, and they might bend their hearing to its utmost pitch, but naught was to be heard except the rain, now marching to the wind, now steadily falling over miles of open country. They were so nearly at the end of their hard task that they judged it wisest to complete it in the dark. The coffin was exhumed and broken open, the body inserted in the dripping sack and carried between them to the gig. One mounted to keep it in its place, the other, taking the horse by the mouth, groped along by a wall and brush until they reached the wider road by the Fisher's Tryst. It was a faint, diffused radiancy, which they hailed like daylight. By that they pushed the horse to a good pace and began to rattle along merrily in the direction of the town. They had both been wetted to the skin during their operations, and now as the gig jumped among the steep ruts, the thing that stood propped between them fell, now upon one, now upon the other. At every repetition of the hard contact, each instinctively repelled it with the greater haste, and the process, natural though it was, began to tell upon the nerves of the companions. Mifflin made some ill-favored jest about the farmer's wife, but it came hollowly from his lips and was allowed to drop in silence. Still their unnatural burden bumped from side to side, and now the head would be laid as if in confidence upon their shoulders, and now the drenching sackcloth would flap icily about their faces. A creeping chill began to possess the soul of Fettes. He peered at the bungalow. It seemed somehow larger than at first. All over the countryside, and from every degree of distance, the farm dogs accompanied their passage with tragic ululations, and it grew and grew upon his mind that some unnatural miracle had been accomplished, that some nameless change had befallen the dead body, and that it was in fear of their unholy burden that the dogs were howling. "For God's sake," said, making a great effort to arrive at speech. "For God's sake, what's in the lake?" Seemingly Macfarlane was affected in the same direction, for though he made no reply, he stopped the horse, passed the reins to his companion, got down, and proceeded to kindle the remaining lamp. They had by that time got no further than the cross-road down to Orchard. The rain still poured as though the deluge was returning, and it was no easy matter to make a light in such a world of wet and darkness. When at last the flickering blue flame had been transferred to the wick and began to expand and clarify, and shed a wide circle of misty brightness around the gig, it became possible for the two young men to see each other, and the thing that they had along with them. The rain had welded the rough sacking into the outlines of the body underneath. The head was distinct from the trunk, the shoulders plainly modeled. Something at once spectral and human riveted their eyes upon the ghastly comrade of their drive. For some time Macfarlane stood motionless, holding up the lamp. A nameless dread was swaddled like a wet sheet about the body, and tightened the white skin of the face of Fettes. A fear that was meaningless, a horror that could not be kept mounting to his brain. Another beat of the watch, and he had spoken. But his comrade has known, "That is not a woman," said MacFarlane in a hushed voice. "It was a woman who I brought in," whispered Fettes. "Hold the lamp," said the other. "I must see her face." And as Fettes took the lamp, his companion untied the fastenings of Thack and drew down the cover from the head. The night fell very clear upon the dark, well-modeled features and smooth-shaven cheeks of a too familiar countenance, often beheld in dreams, both of these young men. A wild yell rang up into the night. Each leaped from his own side into the roadway. The mount fell, broke, and was extinguished, and the horse, terrified by this unusual commotion, bounded and whirled off toward Edinburgh at a gallop, bearing along with it its sole occupant of the gig, the body of the dead and long-dissected Grey.